Hello, welcome everybody to this new video. With the 12 hours of Nürburgring ahead this Saturday, with a very great lineup to come. We have our CEO on board, we have a BMW Works driver in the team. There will also be Jensen Button racing in this race, so it's going to be very huge. We'll be airing exclusively on Twitch this time around, so now's the time to go over to Twitch, follow my channel, just search for my name, Nils Naujoks. And this video will be about how to set up the car for these various weather conditions, how they work in ACC, what you need to take care of in terms of your tires. I want to thank everyone who is supporting this channel with either the membership or the RST data subscription. If you haven't checked it out yet, go over to my website. There is information, or just ping me on Discord. I guess this should be it. To the video. Last time we went through some of the settings of the menu, so controls, graphics, and that sort of stuff. If you haven't watched it, check it out. And now we're getting closer to the actual driving, and one of the big things in modern sims and in ACC as well is the whole weather system. So I want to take a moment to talk about that and what you have to take into account when taking it to the track, because you essentially can't deactivate the weather. It's always going to affect you, and therefore you should know what's happening, why it's happening, and how you need to adjust the car to make it work for you. The first thing you want to look out for is, and let me swap to the game for that, is of course there is daytime, there is a cloud level, there is the sun angle, in conjunction with the time, of course. You can set an ambient temperature, and from these variables, eventually the temperatures on the track are being calculated. So first thing would be you have the daytime. Of course, when it's at night, the sun isn't shining, then the track isn't heating up as much. Usually the air is a bit colder. So as you go, so every hour basically is different in the game and results in roughly or a tiny bit different temperatures. So if you go to 13, 14 o'clock or something, then your temperatures will likely be a bit higher than in the morning or the evening, because the angle of the sun being at the center of the sky is going to cause the track to heat up. So this is the first variable, is really the time of day. The next variable you will have is so all these basically, but let's make it a little less complex for a start. And what you're basically looking for is the cloud cover. So similar, if the sun is in a higher angle, it heats the track up more, and if more of the sun is covered by cloud, then of course not as much sun is coming through and the track doesn't heat up as much. The same is true for the ambient temperature. If the clouds are a little more, the ambient is going to be as high, but it's less affected by the cloud cover. If then you change the ambient temperature, this is not equal to the air temperature. It is just, let's say, the base temperature you set up in the game, and then depending on time of day, cloud cover, and whatnot you can set up, the actual air temperature is going to result somewhere near this ambient temperature, and then the track temperature can be totally separate from that depending on the sun angle and the cloud level. We'll stick with this for the time being. And why are we even talking about this in the first place? And the reason for this is these temperatures have a huge impact on car performance for two reasons. First, you have the engine of the car being affected by the temperature of the air, because the density changes, and then the car can suck in more oxygen, have a better, burn more fuel essentially, and have higher power output. This is why if the air gets colder in ACC, and I want to stress that the track temperature has less of an influence than the air temperature on lap time, the car will go faster as it gets colder, will go slower as it gets hotter. Of course, the track temperature does have an impact on the tires as well, but I think we need to point out that the air temperature has the bigger influence on lap time. Also, the air temperature then, in conjunction with how much the tire heats up, has an impact on how the pressure will develop after you leave the pits. So you have to take into account when you set up the car in the pits, let's say Well, we can load it in the meantime while I'm talking. If you go to the car in the pits, you're setting it up at, I don't know, let's check what the aggressive preset here has in the pressures, something like 24.3 psi or something. Then as you take it to the track, let's just look at the front left here, all right? So 24.3 is a number you shall remember. Let's take it to the track, and now this number has changed to 25.3. This is because now the tires are preheated, so the pressure has already increased a bit with the air in the tire being hotter. Now as you start driving, you will see this temperature increases even more because of the rolling resistance of the tire, because of the cornering. So the surface heats up, and the whole rubber, the different parts of the tire will heat up, and the pressure in the tire will increase even more. Which means your pressure in the pits always has to be fairly below what you will eventually want to have on track. And your target for the dry tires is somewhere between 27.5 to 28.0 psi. This is the range for almost all cars. There might be slight variation of 0.1 or 0.2 psi, but more or less you'd be perfectly fine on all cars if you go for 27.8 or something. This should be well in the window. Then I guess there are a few other factors that influence this. If we go back to the garage, and just to keep it simple here, on some tracks you will experience a lot of temperature development, the pressures always go high, and you want to come back into control of that. So what you could do, one simple thing, is working with the brake ducts here. And what they do is they allow more airflow over the brake discs and brake pads, so there would be more cooling of these parts, because as you drive along, you heat up the brakes. They will reach something like 700, 800 degrees in the braking zone, and this heat is transferred through the rim, through the suspension, and eventually into the tire. So your tire will heat up even more, the pressure will increase even more. And with the brake ducts a little bigger, so sometimes it's said that you use the brake ducts to cool the brake. I wouldn't agree, because the brakes are still, in most cases, and even at the end of the straight, when they have cooled down back to blue or something, they would still be warmer than the tire, because the tire will be running at 80 to 100 degrees or something. The brake pad will, and the brake disc will have something like 100 to 200 or so at the end of the straight. So always going to be more than the tire. So they're always heating, but increasing the brake ducts, you can reduce the amount of heating coming from the brakes. That means if you experience too hot tires, or the pressure increases about 3-4 psi coming from the pits or something, which is quite a large amount, then you maybe want to increase your brake ducts a tiny bit, depending on which axle of the car is more affected. Vice versa, if you can't get temperature into the tires because it's at night, for example, then you can turn the brake ducts down a little, allow a little less airflow, let the brakes heat up a little more, get some more temperature transferred to the tire, and then correct your pressures in tire temperature from that direction a bit. Why am I talking about the pressure so much? Well, if the tire is overinflated, then you won't have the maximum amount of surface of the tire on the surface of the track. And if it's underinflated, the same is true. So if it's overinflated, you only have the middle of the tire on the track. I mean, it's an exaggeration, of course. And if it's underinflated, you only have the sides of the tire on the road, and the middle is kind of hanging through in a way. So in the end, having the optimal pressure just leads to the car having the best and biggest contact patch with the road, and this allows it to go faster in the end. And therefore, since the tire is the only really contact patch you have between you and the track, it's really important to really get this right, and therefore the pressures are one of the most important bits. The user interface in ACC kind of assists with that, with the tire app having kind of an indication of what the game is doing. And if we look at the interface here at the bottom, now the car has parked a bit and everything has turned blue, so the color is a representation of the temperature. And there you have, well, 3 bars for each tire, plus a smaller bar next to it which represents the brake disc. And these 3 bars have a meaning additionally to temperature as well, which means the middle pillar indicates how well the tire is inflated. If the middle pillar is too small, then it means that the tire is underinflated. If the middle pillar goes above the other two on the outside and inside of the tire, it's overinflated. So basically you just want to look out for this pillar being the same size as the inside and outside, and that usually will be reached somewhere between these 27.5 to 28 psi. Now that we sorted the dry conditions, let's go to the little more complex wet or wettish conditions, because this is where things start to become complicated and it's a little bit more difficult to get the pressures right there. So let's start in the game again, and if we head over to the weather settings here, then you can see already there are a couple presets that you can use. So cloudy would just be temperature affected, there's no wetness or rain yet, but if you start with light rain, you can see these wetness and standing water sliders kind of changing already to some preset values, and it gets more as you go higher through these severe conditions, and you can even see the storm isn't even the worst condition you can technically have. So if we went for custom, we could say we want 100% wetness, 100% standing water, but probably this isn't something these guys would really excel at. Let's talk something deeper here, because there's a lot happening in the game that isn't obvious, I think, unless you're already very familiar with it. So first we have these weather conditions, which are not equal to the track conditions. So what we have is these light rain, medium rain, heavy rain, and stormy kind of things. And these would be the indicators you have on the top right of your screen when you're in the pit, or as the weather forecast in the app when you cycle through the menu. The track condition, though, is something different. For example, if you go here in the dry conditions, we would have a green track, for example, which just means it's the start of the weekends, the cars are just arriving, it's probably a bit dusty, and there's not much rubber on the track, so the grip is a little lower, and I'd say the green conditions are about 2 seconds slower than the optimal conditions. Then you have the fast conditions, which just means probably Saturday, cars have driven a bit, the support series have driven a bit, and there's a little more grip available already. The cars will be faster. Let's say they're trailing by about 1 second behind the optimum conditions or something. And then you would have the optimum condition where you should achieve the fastest lap times from a grip perspective on track. But now when rain comes in, and this is, I guess, where it becomes difficult, there are a couple more states that you can't get here from the menu. For example, these would be, I don't think I can even recall them because it's hard to recreate them. For example, there would be a greasy condition, which is happening when the track was rubbered in initially and then it starts raining. Then this rubber would become really slippery as it gets washed off the track. As the rain progresses, you would essentially remove the grip from the track, you remove the rubber, and then you get to some sort of damp condition once a small layer of water has come down on the track. And these are some of the very tricky conditions that you have when the rain starts. Usually, once the rain has started falling down, you don't have to immediately go for the wet tires. Most of the time it takes a couple laps for the track to become wet enough for the wet tires also to work. So there's a bit of an overlap where the dry tire still is the best tire. Usually that would be your engineer telling you, or this pop-up message on the screen that will indicate when the wet tire is optimum. But let's talk about this intermediate condition, so to say, for a second. And therefore, let's just take it to the track. So now in the pits, you can see on the top right corner of the screen, you have the weather forecast, which is quite severe, to be honest, with this stormy clouds ahead in the next 5 minutes, and well, that's half a minute in the next minute. But you can see we have greasy track conditions now, which is due to me setting the track to optimal before. So now the grip is being washed away basically, and the track is in a condition where it keeps getting worse, so to say. And now if we go to the setup, there is one very important thing now to note about the dry tires, which are very likely still the better option. In this case, when the track is wet, the dry tires won't be able to generate heat anymore because there's not as much grip available. Also, it's probably a bit colder, plus the water is having a cooling effect as well, which just means your tires are unlikely to increase in temperature and increase in pressure. And now your way of thinking really has to change, which means now when the tire is preheated and you leave the pits, let's do it right now. We had 27.5 set up, and now it's going to be a lot lower because there are no blankets applied. What's going to happen now, as soon as I start driving, is very likely that there is not enough grip available for the tire to heat up, so it will become even colder, and the pressure is going to decrease even more. So we're never reaching this window of 27.5 to 28. So in these very tricky conditions, you can also see the engineer telling me the wet tire is optimum by now. So now the track has moved on to damp already. So quite a quick change. And now we have to go to the setup and think a little further. Usually in these damp conditions, the dry tire will lose somewhere between, depending how wet it really is, 2 to 4 psi. So we want to take our pressures about 2 to 4 psi above what it will be once the tire has cooled off. So if we take it to the track now, you can see if the tire is colder, and I've set up 30 psi on the front left, on track, when it starts cooling out, the pressure is actually going to decrease and comes back to the window. Now, back in the pits, let's go for the wet tire, and I really only want to walk you through the line of thinking there, not really do too long of a video for you. The wet tire has a different optimum, which is somewhere between 30 psi and 30.5 psi. The other difference is the wet tire works a bit differently in how it creates temperature. So by design, the wet tire creates temperature still in wet conditions because it generates grip there, and for that reason also generates temperature and heat, which means for the rain tire, in the rain, it will also start generating higher pressures as you drive along, especially when the weather is kind of in between and the weather tire just started to become the optimal, or you're slightly early into the pits because you know the weather is going to change further and the wet tire will be optimum in a couple of laps, but you're pitting now and you don't want to pit again, then you probably end up with a wet tire that is kind of still not optimal because the track is too dry. And in this scenario, you will have to take that into account in terms of pressure because the tire will develop a lot of heat. And early on, this could mean that you have to take a lot of pressure out of the wet tire because it's going to heat up so much. For example, it could be 4 psi below where you want the tire to be eventually because there's so much heat and so much pressure generated in the tire. On the other hand, the more wet it becomes, the more pressure you have to fill up in the tire, because also the rain tire at some point will stop generating a lot of heat and might cool out. So in these scenarios, you have to keep increasing the pressure to eventually match that. And the difficulty really is to know all these different conditions. So a lot of testing is involved to really get this right for wet or rainy races in a way. Another thing in the rain for that reason then is because the temperature just has the same importance really, but in the rain we're always looking at rather more cooling conditions. We can go back to our aero tab, think about the brake ducts in a different way, and now again they could be helping us as well to generate heat in the tire and also keep the brakes up to temperature so they work a tiny bit better in these conditions. So in the rain, more often than not, the brakes will cool out quite a bit because they don't have so much friction, which just means for you can close the brake ducts a bit, allow a little less airflow over the brake discs, and keep some temperature in the brake disc. Just keep in mind this will also affect the tire temperature and the tire pressures, and again, this really just needs some practice for you to get all these values in line in a way that it's really difficult to give you exact values like 2 clicks on the brake ducts will give you 1 psi or something. It really depends on the whole setting of these complex system, and I guess this video is just about to get you into this mode of thinking of taking everything into account in terms of temperature, pressure, and getting your tires right. So I'm taking it to the track now with a wet tire in greasy conditions, which means it's a tiny bit wet, just started raining on the optimal surface. And The rain tire very likely is going to be way too soft for these conditions. It's not wet enough yet for this tire to work. And what you'll likely see is that already now you can see it if you look at the tire wrap below, just by going straight with rain tires in these kind of damp, crazy-ish conditions. They will heat up a lot. The surface goes red right away in the first corner. You can see the pressures are increasing massively and very quickly right now. Even though it's still kind of driving, but it's very certain that you'll be using this tire a lot. You can also see it's very slippery on occasions, especially when the surface is so high already. So let's say part of that was a driving error, and the other part was certainly the tire not being anywhere near it needs to be. And this temperature thing is only going to get worse as I get along, and you can see the pressure is already now 1.5 to 2 psi out of the window where we want to have it, and it doesn't seem like it will stop anytime soon since we have only really covered 3 corners. Now, taking the dry tire in the absolutely equal conditions, so we have a slightly, we still had like an optimum track a second ago. Now it started raining and it's starting to become greasy before it's becoming damp. The dry tire is still kind of working, but you can see the surface of the tire is already turning light blue, which means it seems like the tire will not be able to generate the necessary friction and therefore not the necessary temperature, and it will cool out. Which means at this point in time with this weather condition, seems like even though it says what tire optimum, I'm pretty sure the dry tire would still be the faster one. We just have to account for the tire pressure, which seems to be dropping. Well, how much did it did? Like a psi already now. Let's say by the end of the lap it's rather going to be 2 psi that it dropped below what we had in the pits. And to our target psi of 27.5 to 28, where this tire would have the big surface area on the track, we would have to increase the pressures in the pits by roughly 2 psi. And if we now go back to the pits, take a look at how much this will actually mean, we can see in the setup, when we go there to the tires, this would need to go up to basically 29 psi or above, because then it drops down back to 28. I hope this video gave you all a nice overview of how the weather system in ACC works and what you need to take into account. I guess all that it leaves me with is saying goodbye. See you next time around. Give this a like, subscribe, join the membership. Goodbye.